Hey up, and welcome to Corey's Corner. This video is going to be more like my older videos, which I'm sure some of you will be glad to hear. And it's going to be some blackpilled stories. Now, usually when I make these storytime videos, it's just one story in the video. But this time I'm going to be telling a bunch of short stories, mostly from my childhood. So the first one I thought of happened many years ago when I was in the 4th grade, or the equivalent of. We had these people come into our school from the ambulance service to teach us first aid and stuff. And so they brought us all into the main hall where we had assemblies and things like that, and we all got put in pairs, right? So groups of 2 to work together. Now obviously people wanted to be in pairs of boys or girls, since this was back when boys still thought girls were gross or whatever. So everyone wanted to go with their same gender. So for the most part the teachers honoured this, except we had a single girl and boy left over. Now I knew this kid who got left over, and to be honest, I'm kind of on the fence about whether or not he had some kind of mental disability. He's definitely slower than most in the class. He joined us in the 2nd grade, and he was always just playing with little fidget toys. He'd sit at his desk all day flipping a sand timer over and over again and watching it fill up, But he was a good kid, I think. I don't think he deserved what happened, but anyway, we'll get into the story. So the teachers saw this, that these 2 were left over, and they were like, looks like these 2 got left over. Okay, you 2 can be a pair. And all we had to do for this activity was we put our partner into something called the recovery position. It doesn't really matter what it is, but basically the important thing is it's part of the first aid they were teaching us, and you have to touch the person to do it, right? So we got into our pairs and everything, but from the other side of the hall I heard this crying, so I looked over, and this girl who got partnered with this kid was crying and just saying I don't want to be with him, I don't want him to touch me, and this sort of thing, just saying this kind of stuff, literally though, red face, tears streaking down her face, and it was just heartbreaking to see this kid sitting there, because he was sitting next to her, and she was I don't want him to touch me, and running away from him, and he was just sitting there staring at the floor, and you could see in his face he was hurt, and more than that, he was embarrassed, and I would have been, since it was it was in front of everyone in the whole class, and even if he was a bit dim, he didn't deserve that, This is the kind of thing only a girl would get away with. I remember a few years later in secondary school, this teacher gave us a long lecture when she was putting us in pairs, that being oh come on or whatever when you got partnered with someone was considered bullying. But of course it's one rule for women and another rule for the West. But of course it's one rule for women and another rule for the rest of us. I mean the rest of us. It's not I think there are more than 2 genders or anything. You know what I mean? It's one rule for women and another rule for men. That's society summed up. But yeah, I said this before, but school is one of the most brutal places to be blackpilled, and I mean primary school. And the reason is kids, young kids, are so honest. These days, if something like this happens, I just think, get over yourself, or she's only doing this for attention, or something like that. That's what I'd think if this happened today. But I don't doubt that this girl's tears were genuine, and that's the most brutal thing. And just the thought alone of this guy touching her was enough to make her start crying like someone had told her mum had died. It's absolutely brutal. And kids don't lie or cover things up just to not hurt your feelings. If they think something, you're going to know about it, and that's why school's so brutal. And that's the thing though, girls can get away with things guys can't. I mean, we all know that. But just for example, I was at the train station the other day, and at my train station, a lot of them in England, which is where I live if you didn't know, there are these little shops on the platforms where they sell drinks and stuff, and they're little booths, like an ice cream van kind of thing, but on the platform. And I went up to one to get an apple juice since it's getting hot, June and stuff. And anyway, it didn't look like anyone was there, so I looked over the counter, and there was this girl there. She was in her 20s. She looked a little bit older than me, and she popped up and said something she popped up and said something, but I had headphones on at the time, so I didn't hear what she said. So I took them off, and I was what? And she scanned the drink, and everything was like that. But she was I realised she was crying, and she was oh, it's all bullshit, people spreading rumours about me. I just want to go home and stuff. And in my head I was what is this crazy bitch talking about, I just said to her, yeah, okay, and I just took my drink and left. I mean, I paid for it obviously, but as I was walking away I realised there were 2 possibilities. Either she was a mental chicken oriental person, in which case I can't really judge, though I don't know why they'd give her a job and leave her all alone over here, but whatever. Or more likely that she's just a woman who's been confronted with some kind of minor problem, probably by her own causing, and that's enough to give them a mental breakdown. Now I have no idea what's going on in her life, so I'm not judging. But I'm just saying, right, there's one of the easiest jobs you can have. You just stand in this little booth all day selling people things, and occasionally you have to restock the place. And the booth is tiny, so it's not restocking it in retail or anything. It's not hard. And I just thought, I worked for months in retail, and it's way harder than that. And there were times I wanted to go home, but you never saw me crying. Now again, I don't know what her problem was, but to me, it just goes to show how for most people, their lives aren't that bad. So the moment they have to do some menial work, they have a breakdown. For me, it didn't matter if I was at work or at home. I was still lonely and miserable. So I thought, I might as well wage max. I remember I even came into work on my days off and worked, even though I wasn't getting paid, just because there's literally nothing else for me to do. If that isn't a black pill, I don't know what is. So this next story, I told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again since I told it in my nofap tutorial and that video really sucked. I'm probably going to take it down and remake it, but that's besides the point. So this story happened to me when I was like maybe 8 or 9 years old. I don't remember exactly since it was a long time ago, but it was either before I started watching porn or just after I'd started. And yes, I started watching porn when I was like 9, and no, that's definitely not good for you. Porn is terrible to use at any age, but I mean, come on man, what the fuck were my parents doing? I'm sorry to swear, but come on. Anyway, there was this big family gathering at the time, and because there were so many people, everyone came and met at my grandparents' house, which is pretty big. And after the function or whatever, a bunch of people went home, but a lot more stayed over for the night. And I'm guessing since they, some had driven a long way, they didn't want to drive in the dark or whatever, so despite the house being pretty big, there still weren't enough beds for everyone. And since I was just a kid, I didn't get a spot, and I had to sleep on this sofa thing. Now I got put in a room with 2 beds and space for the sofa, and the people in the room, I'm not exactly sure my relation to them. I didn't know them too well. I'd only met them a few times, but they were a couple, right? So the time came for everyone to go to sleep, and I was falling asleep, as you do. And the thing about these 2 beds is they were on opposite walls, so they were separate, right? Now, I don't know what time this happened, but it was really late, and I was just trying to fall asleep, but it was really hot, so that didn't help, and I was just lying there, and I heard the couple get into the same bed together, like one of them moved across to the other bed, obviously trying to do it quietly, but, I could tell. And I thought, well, that's not so weird, it's not like anything's going to happen. And yeah, I think I just knew what sex was, but I didn't really know what sex was, if you know what I mean. I thought nothing was going to happen, but lo and behold, they started having sex like a few feet away from me. And I know you might be thinking, Corey, how can you be so sure? Well, listen to this, right? It was pretty clear. At one point, I heard one of them say something like, if you have kids listening or whatever, you might want to cover their ears or whatever, but at one point I heard one of them say something like, I felt your dick fall out my pussy, or something like that, right? So you might be thinking, why didn't you say something? But the thing is, what can you really do? Like, what can you say? By the time I knew what was going on, it was too late, so I couldn't really do anything. And anyway, eventually my name came up between the two. They started talking about me, and I think the fact that they were doing it, secretly right beside me was some kind of turn on for them, which is just sick. But anyway, they called out my name to see if I was awake, and in my mind I was like, if I say nothing, they might start again, and then it would be my fault. Now obviously in hindsight I know it wasn't my fault, but as a kid I was kind of raised to see things that way, so I had to make a split-second decision, and I just decided to be like, yeah, like, is it when someone calls your name, you're like, if someone's like Corey, and you're like, yeah, so I said that, and there was just this silence for like 5 minutes. It was awful, but after a while I felt like literally so physically sick. I had to get up and go to the bathroom, which was in another room, and I just threw up in the toilet. And after that, they made me get in the bed with them. I don't know what that was about. They weren't naked or anything, well, not anymore anyway, but it's still pretty weird. Now, the next morning I still felt really ill, and they didn't say anything, but yeah, my mum asked me like what was wrong, and I just said like nothing, since I knew that if I told her she'd go absolutely mental. It would be some kind of big family drama, and like I said, as a kid I was just raised to kind of avoid that, since there was a ton of family drama anyway. Like, there'd be fights and screaming and like literally like plate smashing and stuff. I remember another time I heard some people fighting. This was a different couple, but I remember another couple fighting. Well, they thought I was asleep, and one of them was like, I'm gonna go in there and scream like a gorilla and wake that kid up, talking about me. And it's like, what on earth, I was even younger back then. I think I was like 7 when that happened. And I was sort of gaslit into thinking everything was my fault as a kid, and like most sub-5 males are. So I felt guilty for years, after this had happened, since I thought like I'd done something wrong. It also sort of sexually messed me up. I don't want to use the word traumatized because it seems like a strong word, but it did mess me up a little bit, and it led in some ways, I think, to me becoming addicted to porn, which I've only recently overcome. But on a more positive note, I've been on NoFap more or less continually for the past 3 months now. I'm not going to lie, I have slipped up. I'm not, going to come on here and say I'm perfect, but 3 months more or less straight is pretty good. I'm at the point where I don't even think about porn anymore, which is very, very good, right? But anyway, I would encourage everyone who's listening to do NoFap and stop watching porn, but whatever. Anyway, I'm going to end this on a classic black pill story, since I know this video is getting kind of long. You could say I saved the best till last, so here we go. So this story happened to me in the 6th grade, which in my country is the first year of secondary school. I know it's the first year of middle school in America, but whatever. Now, there was this girl who I really liked. I'll call her Becky for this story, since she kind of was one. Anyway, she was really smart, and she was kind of my type. Not really anymore, but as you guys know, I'm not picky, right? So I did like her, but I was too nervous to ask her out myself, because I was just a little kid. But I was talking to this kid who was sort of my friend, but in that kind of way when, you know, you're not really sure if you can trust them. They're just kind of someone you talk to. Come to think of it, that's like describes 90% of my friends, but whatever. So I told him I liked her, and he was like, you gotta tell her, bro, ask her out, be confident and all that shit. And I was like, I don't know, I'm so nervous and stuff like that. But according to him, he knew this other guy who liked her and was gonna ask her out, so I needed to hurry up and get to her before he swooped in, basically, was his implication. So yeah, anyone who knows like marketing and stuff knows a sense of urgency will make someone more likely to buy something. So yeah, I was like, you know, fair enough, I'll ask her out. But in the end I chickened out again, you know, and so he was like, I'll go talk to her. And I wasn't there to see this, but from what I understand, he basically told her there was someone who liked her, and she was like, is it Corey? So I guess I was I must have been pretty obvious about it when I talked to her and stuff. And apparently she said she wasn't interested in dating, and I remember being really hung up about it at the time, which is kind of funny looking back, because it was like, that was my first proper rejection, you know, and there'd be many more to follow, and I was like so devastated, and now it's just like every other week that's happening to me. But anyway, I also remember feeling really ashamed for some reason, like I was a worm or disgusting or something, for even thinking I had a chance with her. Like I said, the gaslighting and the victim blaming that goes on with sub-5 males is insane. But you might be thinking, this story isn't that bad, you know, it's pretty generic. And yeah, you'd be right, because so far this isn't the major black pill bit. So going forward in time a bit, if you've seen some of my videos, you might know I used to get the bus to school, and so did this girl. Now our school ran a few buses, and all the kids who used the bus had a bus pass with their specific bus's letter printed on it. For example, you might be on bus C, so you'd carry a card, and they had a big letter C printed on it, right? And kids from different buses weren't allowed to get on other buses that weren't on their route, so that's important to the story. So one day I was sitting on this bus, and Becky got on like usual, and this other kid I didn't recognise got on behind her, and of course it was a guy, and they were both looking around kind of nervously, obviously since he wasn't meant to be there, but I guess the bus driver didn't notice or just didn't care, and we got dropped off as usual. And when we got to my stop, I got off along with Becky, and this guy got off, and so I started walking home, and on the other side of the road, I was just walking home, I just looked over and I saw this hill, and they were both walking up this hill, and they were holding hands, and I just thought, not ready to date anyone yet, my arse, you know. Now I don't blame her for rejecting me, but that was just such a brutal black pill, you know what I mean. And yeah, anyway, I think that's quite enough black pills for one day. This video is getting on a bit, isn't it? If you have black pill stories of your own, comment below. Like if you like the video, and dislike it if you didn't like it. I just want your honest opinions. Subscribe for more content like this, and yeah, I'll see you guys next time.